Imagine, for a second, that you're totally submerged in the deep ocean. It's dark, it's shifting, and it's incredibly volatile. If you try to impose some rigid top-down management structure down there, well, it would literally shatter under the immense pressure and constant change. And yet, life thrives, right? In this explainer, we're going to look at exactly why top-down control fails in complex environments. We'll explore how a completely new wave of organizational design is taking its cues from nature to build systems that don't just survive all that volatility, but actually learn and grow from it. Welcome to Episode 7, Feedback Loops and Hidden Order.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever watched a massive school of fish dart away from a predator in absolute perfect unison? Or maybe you've seen a colony of ants building those insane, intricate, air-conditioned cities. The defining mystery of these massive coordinated actions is that they happen with zero central authority. There's no CEO ant. There's no middle manager fish barking orders. So how on earth do they pull it off?
Well, in nature, what we're looking at is called swarm intelligence. Instead of relying on a boss, these leaderless organisms use a framework of coordination, cooperation, decision-making, and collaboration. They follow very, very simple local rules. Things like stay a certain distance from your neighbor, or move when the fish next to you moves. That's it. And from those simple, localized interactions, these highly resilient, flexible, global patterns emerge. The group basically behaves as a single, highly intelligent organism.
Part 1. Thinking in Complex Systems. Now, we aren't just talking about biology today. We're actually translating these biological swarm mechanics into the fundamental science of systems design. To really understand how we can build human organizations that act like these resilient swarms, we have to look at the underlying math and structure. For that, we turn to Donella Meadows and her absolute classic book, Thinking in Systems. She defines a system beautifully. She says it's an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. So we're not just looking at the parts themselves, we're looking at the invisible threads connecting them. A system is defined by its elements, its interconnections, and its overarching purpose.
And Meadows broke the anatomy of these systems down into 4 core components. First, you've got your stocks. These are the resources that actually accumulate. Think of water filling up a bathtub or capital sitting in a treasury. Then you have flows, which is simply the rate at which those resources enter or leave. Third, and honestly this is absolutely crucial, you have feedback loops. These are the built-in mechanisms that let the system self-regulate, sensing changes and adjusting those flows automatically. And finally, leverage points. These are those magic spots within a complex system where just a tiny shift in one thing can produce massive changes in the whole shebang. If you want to change the world, you got to find the leverage points.
Building on Meadows, we bring in Melanie Mitchell's brilliant work from Complexity, a guided tour. She focuses heavily on something called a complex adaptive system. Now, whether we're talking about ants, the neurons firing in your brain right now, or traders screaming on a stock market floor, these are all systems where simple components interact to produce incredibly rich, totally unpredictable global patterns. It's literally nonlinear dynamics in action. The whole becomes vastly greater and a whole lot smarter than the sum of its parts.
Part 2. DAOs as living organisms.
So let's shift our paradigm for a minute. Let's take all this incredible science, the biology, the complex systems, the nonlinear dynamics, and let's apply it directly to Web 3. Specifically, let's totally reconceptualize decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. Web 3 is essentially this massive petri dish of live cultures, right? It's a huge experiment in corporate and social evolution. But for a long time, we've kind of been designing DAOs the wrong way. We've treated them like machines. Mechanistic DAOs are fragile. They're static. They're closed systems. They run on the assumption that if you just write the perfect code, the organization will run flawlessly forever. But reality is messy. So the new biomimetic approach treats DAOs as living institutions. These are resilient, adaptive, open socio-technical systems. They exchange information, labor, and capital with their environment. They don't just blindly execute code, they actually adapt to survive.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the concept of autopoiesis. Coined by biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, it basically describes the self-producing character of living systems. Think about a biological cell. It's constantly regenerating its own boundaries and components. For a DAO, autopoiesis means the organization isn't defined just by that initial smart contract deployment. No, it's defined by its ongoing continuous ability to reproduce trust, legitimacy, coordination, and memory, even when the environment around it is radically changing. Part 3. Feedback Loops and Emergence.
To achieve that continuous survival, these living institutions need a nervous system. They need to sense and regulate themselves. We call this the organizational metabolism. Just like you metabolize your breakfast into energy, a DAO metabolizes 5 key elements: information, labor, capital, attention, and legitimacy. In this model, a DAO's treasury isn't just some static bank account holding funds. Actually, scratch that. It's more like an ecosystem steward driving these regenerative, circular value flows, where capital cascades through the whole system to sustain its life over the long haul.
But of course, systems do fail. And when we look at risk management, we really have to reframe how we view institutional collapse, like the infamous Terra/Luna crash or the original DAO hack. In an adaptive system, these failures are ecological signals. They're blaring alarms telling us that our governance latency, the time it takes to actually make a decision, was just dead wrong. They show us that relying on sporadic, heavy voting is way too slow for a fast-moving crisis. To survive, DAOs need continuous sensing. They need automated feedback loops to adjust in real time before total collapse occurs.
Part 4. Designing Adaptive Governance.
So you might be wondering, how do we actually build this? How do we take this highly theoretical framework and make it real? Well, we do it by designing adaptive governance. We create these cybernetic whirlpools where smart contracts, AI, human agency, and legal frameworks perfectly intersect. Let's move to and see how this builds into a real-world application with the DAO345 Foundation. This is a real project, acting as a live sandbox testing ground for these exact concepts. Located down in the Cayman Islands, DAO345 is structured to implement polycentric governance. Drawing on the work of Elinor Ostrom, this means authority isn't fully centralized, but it's not fully decentralized either. Instead, power is distributed across multiple, overlapping centers of decision-making that cooperate and adapt together.
So, the crucial point is how this architecture mimics multicellular organisms. Look at this mapping for a second. The Cayman Foundation acts as the mothership. It's the central legal container. Beneath that, you have LLC vehicles acting as a hunter-seeker fleet. These are mission-specific sub-DAOs evolving at their own speeds. And finally, the technological stack of smart contracts and AI acts as an exoskeleton. Researchers actually compare it to Theo Jansen's strand beasts, those incredible wind-powered kinetic sculptures walking on beaches? The AI and smart contracts form this self-regulating, automated shell that enforces compliance and reacts to external stimuli in real time. Pretty wild, right? The reason this multicellular biomimetic design is absolutely essential is because we live in VUCA environments. That stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Traditional models assume stability. They just try to manage the occasional change. Adaptive DAOs totally invert this. We must now assume continuous change and design for continuity. Polycentricity and distributed coordination are the secret sauce. They allow these organizations to absorb immense environmental complexity without shattering. They bend, they learn, they adapt, and ultimately they survive.
We're moving far away from the days of passive users just logging into rigid software. We're moving toward a world of active agents participating in self-sustaining, multidimensional ecosystems. The very rules of human aggregation are fundamentally changing right before our eyes, shifting from centralized control to this emergent, swarm-like intelligence. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. As these cybernetic whirlpools evolve into true living institutions, what role will you play in the hidden order? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking out the invisible systems shaping our world.